The first of our presentations, is aimed at summarizing the findings of this working group on strategic infrastructure planning. It was a group that met 3 times in person during 2019, and one looks back at the benefits, I think, of groups meeting in person, both the social and the productivity benefits, which I think are difficult to equal in a Zoom meeting, but here we are doing our best remotely. We followed up these meetings with a report developing strategic approaches to infrastructure planning, which was published by the ITF earlier this year. Around, I think it was 15 countries represented on the working group, and we had a very wide range of expertise in infrastructure planning that went well beyond and differed from traditional economic modeling methods. We looked at 2 aspects of infrastructure planning, really. Firstly, the institutions responsible for such planning. And then we looked at the methods, appraisal, decision-making, and evaluation methods, and I'm going to cover both of these briefly. We started from the well-established understanding of the role of infrastructure in modern economies, its contribution to economic growth, evidence both from macro studies of aggregate relationships and from the slightly more recent evidence on microeconomic effects. We reviewed the role of these microeconomic effects in our work, and how it's included in appraisal methods. We noted that infrastructure spending can do much more than boost the real economy. It can contribute to people's well-being in ways that are not measured directly in the GDP metric. We discussed the processes used in different countries for problem identification, scheme selection, choice of options, and decision-making, because successful infrastructure planning requires a clear process for moving from a long list of problems and perceived needs to a program which has a high probability of delivering the outcomes that ministers and voters expect. We also considered the interdependencies between the different sectors responsible for infrastructure investment. We noted in particular a need to coordinate between the plans of these different sectors, which often requires cooperation between different government departments, and we noted how such cooperation is often quite challenging to achieve, particularly in countries like the UK. And so we reached a view that strategic infrastructure planning, taking a top-down view of future needs and existing inadequacies, looking across sectors, that offered a promising way of addressing these issues. And we decided that it was timely to set down our deliberations and write a report to inform governments and others about how such plans might be drawn up. Next slide, please. So we started with a survey of participating countries to find out about the processes they used for national infrastructure planning. We tended to focus, as the ITF, on transport, because that's our area of expertise and the sector in which government, rather than the private sector, is most closely involved. We found a mixture of approaches to transport infrastructure planning. In general, most planning at the programme and project level was undertaken by the body responsible for delivery of that infrastructure. The methods these organisations used to select specific projects tended to follow national or regional guidelines and policy objectives. At this stage, most countries brought in stakeholders to help gain local support for the project. The final decision to approve the spending on the project was generally made by government ministers, whether regional or national. Often, in the case of simple, smaller schemes, decisions were made by officials following government guidelines. Approval for the scheme to go ahead tended to follow formal appraisal processes, usually based, as Roger was saying earlier, on cost-benefit methods. This was complemented in many cases by the inclusion in the business case of wider policy objectives. These would often include regional considerations as a means of addressing political concerns about peripheral or left behind places. In many countries, there was some independent external assessment of the cost-benefit appraisal. In some countries, there was also provision for ex-post evaluation of the scheme. Next slide, please. Cool. In best ITF tradition, those countries that had established strategic infrastructure planning organizations were invited to compare and contrast the approaches they used, because this would enable us to come up, we thought, with some ideas about best practice. We started with reviewing the ways in which strategic infrastructure planning bodies were organized and differences in their governance. We found that most planning authorities were given the role of advising government. Governments were under no obligation to accept their advice. Members of the body tended to be independent experts with a wide range of expertise in infrastructure and in economic regulation. So the organization's role was mainly to produce evidence and analysis so as to influence opinion. We thought that the independence of the planning body from political interference, we thought that seemed a very good way of winning wider support for the plan. We noted that independent bodies needed clear objectives and strategic direction, both in terms of the sectors they're expected to cover and the outcomes that their plans are required to deliver. For example, they need to know whether their plans are expected to meet the test of value for money based on cost-benefit analysis. They need to know whether land use planning and changes in the location of economic activity fall within their remit or not. And we noted that clear definition of the sectoral and functional scope of the planning body's responsibilities was really essential to avoid unrealistic expectations of what might be delivered by the plan. Next slide, please. So we identified a number of requirements for successful infrastructure planning. Uncertainty about the future was best addressed through the use of scenarios, use of a range of assumptions about the future growth of the main drivers of travel demand and how in future people might respond to these changes. The use of scenarios has become commonplace in transport appraisal. However, it still tends to be restricted to the robustness of an individual project to a range of scenarios. We noted it was much less common to assess the impact of these different assumptions on the choice of a set of options within a program of schemes. And accounting for scenarios across modes and across sectors really is something of a challenge, both because of the interdependencies between schemes within a program and interdependencies between sectors. We noted too the need for consultation, that planning bodies' recommendations are more likely to gain acceptance if infrastructure providers and users understand the planning process and have been involved in the preparation of the plans. And consultation can ensure that key challenges identified to the public are covered in the plans. We noted that planning bodies' job is made much easier and more realistic if they are given a budget constraint. For example, the UK's National Infrastructure Commission is told to assume that between 1 and 1.2% of GDP can be allocated to transport and other infrastructure investment. We also noted the value of measures of how the network is performing. This facilitates both comparisons over time and comparisons between regions and countries. Next slide, please. I'm just showing some examples of strategic infrastructure planning bodies whose plans and methods we reviewed. Much more about these can be found in the working group's report. They are, I note, all Anglophone countries, perhaps because the need that infrastructure planning was greater in such countries. I mean, we noted that many other countries represented on the group managed to plan strategically across modes and across sectors without an independent planning authority. Next slide, please. Planning of infrastructure really has no purpose in absence of a clear process for selecting options for possible inclusion in the plan and for helping decision makers decide which of these options are the more likely to deliver their policy objectives. These processes, in most circumstances, include some assessment of whether the benefits of the proposed project are likely to exceed its costs using cost-benefit methods. A sound formal appraisal method also gives decision makers some reassurance that all the significant impacts of the project have been identified and weighed up when they are faced with the choice. They are less likely to encounter a legal challenge that an impact that some people believe is important has been omitted if a thorough appraisal method is used. And it can help them understand how the project might contribute to other wider policy objectives, such as place-based policies, the impact of schemes on local employment or on regional development, and the impact on carbon reduction. We found that in general, decision makers found some form of appraisal process as a necessary and often a helpful contribution to decision making. We noted the widespread use of cost-benefit appraisal, encouraged perhaps by the many roundtables that ITF has held to promulgate the findings of new research and better evidence. Next slide, please. So we reviewed, and I suppose we reviewed it quite briefly really because the methods are so well established, the standard methods of cost-benefit appraisal, which have been established over the past 50 or more years. As we all know, we start with the transport model, which represents transport users' responses to a change in the network over the lifetime of the proposal. This is compared with the do minimum counterfactual and with other options for remedying the problem. These responses, that people make the trip in less time, or they choose a new destination or change mode, are then linked to the money values based on research into people's preferences. For example, their willingness to pay for travel time savings. This helps us understand the magnitude of any response and gives the money value we use to estimate the transport user benefits. We then add to these the environmental and other impacts. They're often taken from the transport model of traffic flows and speeds and area types or more detailed place-based data. And the values for those impacts, as we all know, are usually derived from estimates of damage costs based on health or environmental research. For comparison of these costs and benefits, the NPV or the BCR can give decision makers an indication of whether the option provides value for taxpayers' money and demonstrates which option is likely to deliver the highest returns. Next slide, please. We then reviewed methods which have been developed to incorporate what are generally known as wider economic benefits into appraisal methods. Again, these have been the subject of many recent roundtables, and we're going to discuss them later in other papers for this roundtable. And so this really just serves as a brief reminder. I guess the first consideration is that these impacts can be valued in a way which are additional to the standard cost-benefit analysis, travel time savings, and other impacts identified on the previous slide. They're additional because they're external effects which are not part of the decision set used by individual transport users on which the traditional appraisal is based. UK appraisal methods identified 3 separate wider impacts. The first is the effect on productivity through the concept of agglomeration, supported by evidence that places with higher levels of effective density or access to economic mass tend to be the more productive. Since effective density or access to economic mass is determined by transport costs and employment densities, investment which reduces transport costs can be shown to increase productivity, particularly in places with high levels of employment density and where transport networks perform well. The increase in accessibility can also attract additional jobs augmenting the measure of effective density. The second effect in the Department for Transport's list is the effect of induced investment which would not have taken place in absence of the scheme. Most commonly, this is in terms of the construction of new housing or commercial floor space. It's additional because it's dependent on the additional capacity provided by the scheme, and it tends to be measured in terms of the land value uplift after deducting any external environmental or other impacts on the value. The third effect is the impact of the reduction in commuting costs on labour supply, with evidence for such an effect based mainly on research into the effects of taxes and benefits on participation in the labour force. There's much more on these wider benefits in the report, and it's just worth saying that the impacts tend to be data intensive, and the second line dynamic effects, the formulation effects, take into account the firm's responses to changes in land use on account of changes in transport infrastructure, tend to be very uncertain because every place is different. Next slide, please. Our report discussed the integration of these wider impacts into standard cost benefit appraisal and into the information provided by analysts and officials to politicians and other decision makers. We noted that some impacts are inevitably less certain than others. Decision makers need to be reminded that they should put less weight on these less certain benefits. For example, they might be asked the question of how much value they would need to attach to those less certain impacts to make the benefit to cost ratio for that scheme as good as the more typical that they are likely to do.
Tom, sorry to interrupt. I know you're nearly at the end, but could you get your papers off your microphone? You hear the papers rustling rather than your voice.
Sorry.
Thanks.
They should also consider policies that might help to give greater certainty. For example, in projects that are expected to have an impact on labour supply, the likelihood of this materialising might be increased by a programme of training and skills enhancement for job seekers. We also noted that the wider benefits assessment provides an additional metric of policy relevance to ministers, a measure of a scheme's expected contribution to local, or in some cases, national GDP. And we noted that while cost-benefit analysis in its traditional form tends to treat all places and all people as equal for policy and political purposes, this restriction isn't really a major limitation. However, transport, unlike many other place-based policies, faces a real challenge because of the classic two-way road problem. A new road between City a policy priority area, and City B does not necessarily lead to City A benefiting if the improvement results in firms and households moving to City B. And we looked at a number of cross-border schemes, noting that the challenges of place-based appraisal are compounded by differences in institutions, in data, and in appraisal, and in modelling methods. Next slide, please. The report devoted a chapter to ex post evaluation. Again, only a brief mention here because we're going to cover this in more detail in the rest of this round table. We noted that evaluation serves a number of purposes. It provides for accountability, monitoring the usage of a new road and comparing it with the forecast demand can quickly show ministers and other decision makers whether the road has delivered at least some of the expected outcomes. Evaluation can also improve the process of delivery when focused on costs, contracts, schedules of works. It can help scheme sponsors understand which procurement methods work best. It's informed inputs to appraisal methods, such as provision of optimism bias. It can also help the learning process. If adequate data have been retained and new data are collected, it can help to show analysts whether the models they have used to represent transport users' responses to the scheme or policy have been broadly correct in their representation of this behaviour. But this is a much more complex task than the accountability objective, as it requires the construction of a new up-to-date counterfactual. What would have happened in absence of the road? And we noted that evaluation can also be helpful in informing strategy over the longer term. Next slide, please. I put up some of the challenges faced in such evaluation, but I think all of these are going to be discussed in the papers we've got later on this week. So I'm going to skip over that one, and I'm going to just show the last two slides, please. Next slide, which is simply a list of the recommendations of our report. I'm not going to be tedious and read all of these out, but the slide back will be circulated, and this will provide a useful aid memoir for the people reading the slides to understand the recommendations we made. So that's all I've got to say about the Working Group on Strategic Infrastructure Planning's recommendations and its deliberations. I would like to thank in particular Rex for making the working group a very enjoyable and informative time for me and for others. And I think the report does very good justice to the work of the group. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions or engage in discussion.